Welcome to the CFO Track podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hunter, and every week I'll be bringing you stories from some of Australia's best and brightest CFOs and the lessons they learnt along the way. My goal for the podcast is to provide learning and development opportunities for those wanting to get to the level of the guests on this show, but they just didn't have the access to those lessons otherwise. Let's get into it. On the show today, I'm joined by the CFO of Hume Bank, Akbar Shah. Akbar spent the first 17 years of his career at NAB, including a secondment in the epicenter of the banking industry in New York. He gives brilliant advice around crisis management after working through both the GFC and COVID with the same business, and then how to continue your career development by going to the other end of the spectrum in a much smaller and regional-based business. I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. This episode is brought to you by Tallystone.com, the all-in-one data room, capital register, and board workflow in one continuous system of record. Check out the detail mid-episode. Akbar Shah, welcome to the CFO Track podcast.
Hey Tom, how you going?
Yeah, good. How's your week been? What have you been up to?
It's been good. Weather's changing a little bit, Melbourne. So I think summer's well behind us now. Still pretty busy, but yeah, unfortunately, sunshine is a thing of the past. But otherwise, I've been good. Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks, Tom.
Nice. I was so we're in March now, but I was in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and it was just one of those classic Melbourne early March weekends where it was just phenomenal. But it seems like that's now passed.
Yeah, I think there's still a tendency to have those odd days, particularly this late. But yeah, I think as I said, summer's well and truly behind us. But yeah, still plenty going on. Obviously, very interesting times in a global sense and in the economic sense, which keeps things interesting. But all good from my side. Nice.
Well, I've already given the listeners a bit of an overview to you, but I can never do it justice. So for those that aren't aware, can you give a bit of an overview of you, where you're at the minute, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently sort of year 5 into a CFO role at Hume Bank. And for those that don't know, Hume is a mutual bank based in Albury, Wodonga, with some offices in Melbourne as well. So yeah, CFO role, a classic or traditional CFO role across, financial management, FP&A, Treasury, operations. And so I've been doing that for the last sort of 5 years. Prior to that, I'd say I call myself a career banker as such. So was at National Australia Bank for about 16 years prior to that. Across a number of different roles, which I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, so really, from a career point of view, I'd say very much across, banking as such as from an industry perspective, but across a number of different roles with a really strong focus on Treasury and finance as well.
Yeah, cool. We'll come back to that in a bit, but it would be good to go back to the start first of all, because the whole idea behind the pod is to give up and coming finance professionals that context for the growth and how you got to that point. So was there anything particular that drew you to accounting, to finance? Where did it all start?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a long time ago, although it went really quick. I mean, it feels like many years ago when the decision was made. Sure. But I think growing up, Tom, I'd say if I go right back, career, family upbringing, education was such a critical part of any decision, and education was a non-negotiable. And quite interesting from a cultural point of view, education could have been it tends to be quite binary. The culture is all about sort of getting into the medical field, or you're an engineer, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer. They tend to be the top few careers that families from that part of the world tend to have their kids aspire to be. I think what I found very early on was
were you born here?
I was actually born in Singapore. Singapore, and so the family migrated at a pretty young age. But
how old were you?
For all intents, it's about 3 years old. So migrated, migrated at a very early age, and I'd say sort of Aussie from there on. So I think from my perspective, numbers was something that came quite naturally. I really enjoyed, the binary nature of that, the fact that there was no subjective nature when it comes to numbers, and I enjoyed it. Sort of, it's something that resonated well. I sort of lent more and more towards, I guess you'd say, accounting and finance, mainly because I guess from a global perspective, how portable it is from an industry and career point of view. structured thinking. As I said, you can, irrespective of where you are in the world, it sort of it has a consistency there, and something that really appealed to me about sort of, as I said, whether you're doing it in this part of the world or
Yeah.
finance and accounting in other major markets, there was an element of consistency. So that was the appeal, the international
Yep.
nature of it, and as I said, really enjoyed the numbers side of things.
Did you do accounting at uni?
Yeah, so I did a commerce degree, which,
Yep.
when I sort of speak to most people, I think it's a great degree that, even if you have an understanding that you want to get into the sort of business side of things, it gives you that broad perspective across all
Definitely.
major fields of that, whether it's marketing, management, statistics,
Yep.
accounting, and finance. So yeah, I did a commerce degree, and then moved on to sort of post grad when I started working. But yeah, sort of look back at that. That decision has been a pretty critical one, and a good opportunity, as I said, just to open up the perspectives on the industry and an understanding across the board when it comes to sort of business.
So post grad is in you did it immediately once you were in the workforce or further down the track?
Pretty much, yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much.
right. What did you do?
So joined NAB pretty early on in the career once I finished my undergrad,
Yep.
and then at the time, I think most were sort of pursuing some form of post grad studies. I went down the finance path. So I did a master's at finance in Melbourne.
Yeah, right.
And again, it was a good opportunity, I guess, to solidify the education piece, but then to blend it with some practical real world
Yeah.
experience.
So
I
was
think that
that
was the key there.
were you studying full time and working full time, or how did you manage that?
Studying part time and working full time. So yeah,
Yeah.
so that was an interesting one, but I guess pre family commitments. So you tend
Sure.
to have a bit more time to do things. So yeah, working full time and then sort of night back in the day where lectures were still face to face
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
in the classroom. So doing that at night and yeah, working my way through it slowly, but over a couple of years.
So were you studying your CPA at the same time then? Where did you
No,
start?
well, interesting enough, and I'm sure we'll go through the
Yeah.
career path. But CPA was only something I did recently.
Oh,
So
right. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
I went down a slightly different path. I think most
Sure.
sort of
Yeah.
tend to go CPA or
Yeah.
CA quite early in the career. I went sort of more the finance angle,
Okay.
and then followed up actually many years after that. Did an MBA as well, so try to get
Yeah.
a
Right.
broader
Cool.
perspective. And then more recently, it seems to be one of the minimum benchmarks in the world of accounting and finance. And so,
Sure.
undertook the CPA and got that completed probably about 18 months ago.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, we'll
Yeah.
come back to that in a bit. But what was the first role like out of uni? How did you?
Yeah,
Just what
so
did
as I said, straight out of uni, had really fortunate to get an opportunity to join NAB at the time. Obviously, one of the big
you?
four banks, and really sought after from a I guess a initial stage or a junior perspective in
Yep.
terms of the career.
Yeah.
And I landed a role in the Treasury function of NAB. So it
Okay.
was what we refer to ALM or asset and liability management.
Yep.
I sort of reflect on the time there as being pretty critical in terms of the career path and the learning during that time.
Mm.
Treasury on reflection, and I think continues to be the case, is a critical part of any organisation, let alone a bank. It tends to be
Yeah.
what people describe as a bit of a heartbeat.
Yep.
Tends to bring it all together, whether it's the funding, liquidity, capital,
Yep.
all critical elements of the bank. And so, yeah, joined NAB sort of at that analyst level, supporting the bank and an ALM and liquidity management, and then very
Yep.
quickly moved into what was a group funding function, but it's effectively sort of capital markets role, which is issuing debt on behalf of the bank.
Yep.
As most of your audience may know, the Australian major banks are big issuers of global debt, just given
Yep.
the structural nature of the market and their need to fund the balance sheet. So, yeah, a really interesting role.
Mm.
And as I said, at a time where it became increasingly more important, and I'm sure we'll touch on it, but really great opportunity to not only get an exposure to financial institutions, but
Yeah.
as I said, to be in a treasury function of an ADI was really interesting at that time.
What was the training and L&D stuff like when you were coming in at that point?
It was really good. I think,
Yeah.
I think I was fortunate enough throughout the whole career, particularly early on, that, I was in an environment where it was encouraged.
Mm.
We talked about the postgraduate
Yep.
support, and that was something that NAB really was forthcoming in terms of supporting people through L&D, whether that was the formal
Mm.
approach, obviously the hands-on on the job training, but then also complementing it with further studies, making things flexible, allowing people to do that and sort of balance what they want to do, and whether that was the finance path or any other areas that
Yeah,
people
yeah, yeah.
wanted to sort of lean into. And so,
Yep.
yeah, I think one of the benefits of being in an organisation like NAB was they were huge, and I'm sure they continue to be huge supporters of ongoing development and growth, whether that's the
Yep.
formal or informal path. And so, yeah, I never saw that as being an issue. And the fact that, I was in an organisation that was supportive of that, whether that's your direct line manager or just at an organisational level, I think that's pretty critical as well.
So your path joining a business and doing a grad program or something similar to that versus doing the big four or audit route or whatever, like, where did you see your development being accelerated as a result of taking your path versus the big four path?
Yeah, good question. I think part of the acceleration was the fact that you probably don't have as many numbers. So, the big four, the accounting firms, I'm sure it's still the case, but back in the
Yeah.
day, there would be a whole drove of numbers coming through, and you're in amongst a bigger group of grads
Yep.
coming through. And typically,
Yep.
I'd say at that junior level, at a place like the banks, they tend to be a bit more selective, and so your
Sure.
exposure tends to be probably a bit greater than it would, I dare say.
Yeah.
And so, I was in many ways you're sort of thrown into
Yeah.
the deep end in terms of learning and experience and as I said, exposure. And then you're probably given responsibility. Interesting enough, and others may have a different may have had a different experience, but you're given responsibility and accountability pretty early on, and
Yeah.
that goes two ways. Obviously, you
Sure.
need to show a bit of grit and ambition around that. But where you are showing that, I think the point is that in an organisation like NAB, they definitely weren't hesitant in terms of increasing that level of responsibility and accountability. And so you mix that in with the fact that you're in an area that's very much front and center of what's happening in the global economy as well. So that's
Sure.
probably the other area that you're not necessarily working in some sort of operational function
Yeah.
where you're
Yeah.
not necessarily seeing the connectivity as obvious as it is, but
Sure.
being in a as I said, in a treasury function and then moving into what was more the sort of funding and capital markets area. I mean, these were activities that were impacting the economy, every day, and
Yeah.
vice
Yeah.
versa. And so you were living and breathing economic conditions and the market day to day. And I think from a learning point of view, that's invaluable. I think it just complements that formal training, and you get that real life exposure at the same time.
So because you would have heaps and heaps of people joining Big Four, say 3 or 4 years into their career, and joining at a similar point where, say, you're 3 or 4 years into your career. So for the people that were joining the business alongside you at that point, how do you think you were ahead of them, or what do you think the advantages were around that?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a case of being ahead. I think the
Okay.
benefit is you get people from all different backgrounds in terms of professional background or studies or
Sure.
qualifications. So you get that get that exposure. I think for me it was more the showing a little bit of ambition and showing that you're sort of willing to put yourself out there. And I
Yep.
think where the organisation is supportive and reciprocates, then
Mm.
that's sort of almost the perfect combination of getting that experience.
Yep.
And so I found myself, as I said, to be in a position where I was lucky enough that, yeah, I was obviously, pretty keen and ambitious and young coming through, wanting to learn as much as I can. But then the organisation also, making sure that they were very supportive of that.
Yep.
And coincidentally, and I know we'll touch on it, but coincidentally, we, very quickly, or a few years into the career, ran into what was an interesting moment with the GFC. So that,
Yeah.
in many ways, it almost amplified that learning again. That
100%.
that sort of come out from the textbooks and come into a real life scenario where things were, this was a once in a lifetime type event, and so that again amplified that exposure.
So where you're in Melbourne at the time when it
Yes,
happened?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
right.
what
At the
was
head
what was
office. Yeah.
happening around you? What was happening on a world scale? Because you were still 2, 3, 4 years into your career, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was unbelievable. Like on reflection, it was unprecedented in many
Yep.
ways. We literally went from an environment where access to capital at a cost-effective and efficient perspective
Yep.
was there, and it was there in large amounts. And obviously, Australian banks are very well regarded on a global perspective, and so
Sure.
being able to access that was not an issue. It
Mm.
was a given. And we
Yep.
literally went from that. And I think that, as we talk about a lot of the crisis over the years, but that in particular was one that it worked through very fast. Obviously, it was a built up
Sure.
of some, deficiencies in fundamentals, but ultimately when it
Sure.
hit, markets effectively shut. And so being, again, sort of being in a treasury function at a bank
Yeah.
at a time where, you went from, as I said, very forward, very open markets to an environment where things were completely shut overnight. It sort of led to, a very unique scenario. On reflection, there was a lot of opportunity to learn, but, all of a sudden, a lot of that sort of, operational uncertainty, the
Yeah.
BCP and sort of thinking about contingency planning all
Yep.
came into life. And I think it was, a real critical point and front and
Sure.
center of what the world was experiencing at the time, where, capital markets all froze effectively. We
Yep.
obviously saw, the worst case scenario, which was, primarily in the US, where, we had institutions that were around for hundreds of years that
Yeah.
are obviously gone bust.
Yep.
Others that were forced to sort of merge, otherwise they would have gone bust themselves. So really
Yep.
unusual and unbelievable times. And to be front and center of that, and sort of see that real
Yep.
life example of what can happen,
Yep.
really invaluable from a learning point of view.
So when you were living it, because you're still very early on in your career, and so there's an element of naivety to that as well, right? Like, did you appreciate it for everything that was happening on around you at the time, or you think, oh, is this normal? Like, what
No,
were
I
you
think,
going through?
I think you don't. I think sort of in the
Yeah.
heat of it, you're sort of just working through, okay, day by day, what does that mean? What's the solution look like? How do we come out of it?
Yep.
And it, pretty similar to what we're seeing, in the current environment, where it is
Sure.
literally a day by day proposition. I
Yeah.
think it's probably one of those things where when you reflect in, months or years later after that, and look back and go, oh, that was really
It was
a
fun.
unique scenario, and there was a lot
Yep.
of learnings to come out of it. And,
Yep.
were certain things you do differently or certain things you do the same, etc. But at the time, you're sort of so entrenched in trying to understand, what impact the market has, what impact does it mean for the overall business, and essentially
Yep.
what decisions will the business need to make.
Yep.
As I said, you've sort of gone front and center of that, and the GFC was probably the best example, particularly, as I said, when you think about financial services, but also
Mm.
within financial services, the treasury function that becomes such a
Yep.
critical part of that overall experience, I guess.
So on a day-to-day perspective, you're saying it sort of happened really, really quickly or overnight, but can you be specific about what actually changed within your role or within your day-to-day, and how you managed through that?
Yeah, so day to day, effectively, it meant that access to, as I said, so funding, which was quite significant in terms of
Mm.
amounts that the banks needed to access, that was effectively shut. So it
Yep.
was, okay, what does it look like as a sort of backup plan? What do we need to do? What sort of contingency plans are in place to try to get
Sure.
alternative sources? Relying on relationships, stakeholder management, leaning into what was, as I said, during that time, what had become a much more critical part of the bank's operation. So, all of a sudden, I guess senior management were really in tuned in terms of what it meant for the bank.
Mm.
What were we going to do? How we were going to work our way through it? Ultimately,
Yep.
as things played out, it needed government support, and we did see that obviously through the most recent one being COVID, where the government had to
Sure.
step in, and in that
Yeah.
particular instance, they stepped in and provided some form of sovereign guarantee, which allowed things to slowly sort of start to function again.
Yep.
But on a day to day, it was literally that sort of working through. Okay, what does the alternative source look like? What the opportunities look like, and really doing a lot of what people be doing now around stress testing and scenario planning, and sort of working through, okay, how bad can it get? How do
Yep.
we sort of work our way through this? And as I said, sort of what does backup and sort of plan B look like through that period?
I know that to close a capital round, everything has to be spot on, but we've had our moments where we've had to scramble. The cap table is in a spreadsheet that might be right, the board resolutions are in a Dropbox that nobody's paying for, and an email thread from 2022. And the data room, that was built on a Sunday night because the investor asked for it by Monday. We know better, and we know how risky it is. Tally Stone puts all this in one place. AI-powered data rooms, capital register, board and shareholder workflows. One system that's always current, not just when an investor asks. I use it for story recruitment, and it works like a dream to get set up. So make your job easier and de-risk the DD. It's the infrastructure that your corporate record should have had from day one. Start a free 30-day trial and get a live data room set up in 10 minutes. Use the promo code CFOTrack and find out more at tallystone.com. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, right. And so how long was it before things started to become a bit more normalized or back to a point of return?
Yeah, it actually went for a long period of time. Obviously, it had a ripple effect, and ultimately led to what was a very much a private sector issue. Then ultimately led to governments. We saw a lot of government sector and
Yep.
governments around the world effectively going under pressure from a fiscal
Yeah.
point of view as a result of that. But so I think overall that in many ways there's some remnants of that impact still around. Overall, as a period went on for multi years. But in terms of the immediate impact, I'd say it was a good sort of 12 to 18 months before things started to somewhat normalize and sort of markets opened up very cautiously, obviously. As I said, sort of using that, sovereign guarantee and support. And then slowly things starting to reprice, obviously, spreads and margins and cost of capital was very, completely different to what it was going into that period. We came out the other side at a very different dynamic to that. But yeah, I'd say probably it was a good 12 to 18 months of things really sort of freezing up to the point where they started to evolve a little bit more on a much different footing. But yeah, it started to open things up. But as I said, it sort of worked its way through different stages, and then ultimately it became more of a public sector issue as well.
Yeah, right. So were you still within the same stream when it did start to open up back again, or did you start?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so still sort of in that treasury function, at that part or that sort of function of the bank, and then soon after that, as things become a lot more fluid, albeit at a very different pricing point and a different cost of funds point. That's sort of when I sort of transitioned to more of a sort of client-facing relationship management role in terms of capital markets, but still fundamentally in a similar area in terms of accessing capital, but now doing it sort of on behalf of third-party clients of the bank.
Gotcha. So how did the New York transfer or secondment or however you want to call it, how did that come up?
Yeah, so similar to what we've been talking about. Look, I think really fortunate for me. Again, NAB, I'm sure continues to be the case. Was of the four back then, in many ways, was probably the most international. If that made sense, it's sort of pre that stint or that sort of push that ANZ had gone into Asia, but sort of prior to that period, NAB had operations in the UK, Asia, and obviously some activity in the US. And so, like most, Aussies coming through the commerce, accounting, finance lens, I think sort of a few years into the career, one of the key things is to try to get offshore. And I was no different. Really keen to get that opportunity. I was indifferent in terms of where. I just knew that I was keen to get some exposure. I mean, you love to. Yeah, I mean, you obviously see it. You see the markets operating globally, but to be able to be part of that, I think that was the key. Coincidentally, really fortunate from my point of view, from a timing perspective, an opportunity did open up in the New York office, and I was again sort of given that opportunity to pursue that. The bank sort of supported me and sort of took a chance in many ways, and sort of you'd argue sort of relatively early on in the career, and it was great, from a personal point of view and a business perspective. Great to be able to, as I said, sort of build out a little bit early career at the head office as sort of home market, and then sort of work my way over to what is a very different setup up there, but still part of the organisation. So yeah, great opportunity to spend some time in what is effectively the biggest capital market of the world, and so you've gone from being part of it in terms of sort of still dealing with it, but sort of living and breathing it day to day was a great experience.
What's the presence like of NAB in New York? Like, obviously, here's the home base, right? So is it a pretty significant function, or how does it all look for New York?
Yeah, so different setup. I mean, they're obviously not to the same scale.
Sure.
Most of it, from a personnel point of view. I mean, back then, I would say it was about call it 100 strong staff in Midtown offices there. Very distinct in terms of the activities, and not necessarily doing everything and anything for obvious reasons. They're not typically going head to head with the local banks, but where the bank had a I'd say a niche or a competitive advantage, to support clients of that part of the world is where
Mm.
the bank operated. And so for the capital markets business, it was an obvious one in terms of bringing clients that are based up there into the Australian market.
Yep.
We're top four or top banks in the Australian capital market. So to be able to support those customers that are looking to diversify their funding and have
Yep.
access to different pools of capital, we
Mm.
supported them to sort of get down here and raise capital in Aussie dollars. So yeah, the setup up there tends to be quite distinct in terms of the
Yep.
operations. There's the trading function,
Okay.
relationship management, obviously banking relationship management, capital
Yep.
markets was a big part of it. And then you've got some smaller support staff, your typical,
Sure.
your finance, your IT, tech. So, but very much a small subset, almost a
Yeah.
microcosm of
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
mothership up there, and a smaller layout, which is again from a career point of view and exposure point of view, very different dynamic. Going
Definitely.
from a market where everybody knows the big red star and
Yeah.
the big banks to
Sure.
a market where literally every bank in the world operates, and so the presence and the people sort of are not necessarily attuned to what National
Yep.
Australia Bank is up there as much as they are down here.
So do you think that was the biggest challenge, just being not a no-name player, but a lesser player in a massive market? Was that the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think
Yeah.
the reality is you're in a much more competitive landscape. That's
Yep.
the reality.
Mm.
People are competing. You got, as I said, nearly every bank in the world has some form of operation there.
Yep.
I think the benefit, albeit the competitive nature of it, the benefit of being niche in terms of
Mm.
what we did.
Yep.
Was the added advantage. And obviously, when you're speaking to clients about the Australian market and being an Australian bank, there's a natural tendency
Sure.
to listen to those. So absolutely, yeah. So the challenge, I think, the challenge is on scale,
Mm.
and the ability to compete against what are effectively some of the biggest banks in the world.
Yep.
And sort of how do you sort of navigate through that and cut through areas where you can really add value. I think that's
Yep.
the opportunity. And then there's the obvious piece around operationally. Again, you're not in a team
Mm.
of thousands or hundreds like you're
Sure.
talking
Sure.
about a small subset. You're still plugged in to the
Yep.
rest of the business around the world,
Yeah.
obviously, but yeah, you're in a very different footing now in terms of just the setup and the structure. And in many
Yeah.
ways, you're sort of standalone from that
Yeah.
point of view.
And so, what do you think you took from that? When not necessarily when you came back, but in terms of professional development, personal development, what did you take from it?
Yeah, it's probably a resilience, Tom. I reckon
Yeah.
it's just the classic case of now you're in a world where you're not as not as familiar. You're having to
Mm.
do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of
Yep.
pushing messaging out or having
Sure.
those conversations with clients. But then there's also that piece about, okay, how do you get a much broader perspective on the business?
Yep.
Obviously, as I said, during my time early on in the career, you did get that exposure, but now being
Mm.
in a more smaller subset of the overall business, you're sort of
Yep.
dealing into different areas, whether that's the tech side, the HR piece in terms of getting the right people into the
Yeah.
team. Operationally, you're rolling up your sleeves, and so I think that the biggest thing about that is sort of how do you lean into areas that wouldn't typically be the case because you've
Yep.
got functions that are dealing to that. You're now having to do that yourself, and so it takes a different mindset. It takes a different approach. Some people enjoy it. Some people may struggle to sort of have that switch, but I
Yep.
think it's the classic case of going from a much larger, well-established institution into something that's a bit more bespoke in many ways,
Yep.
albeit part of the broader organisation, and a bit more nuanced in terms of, as I said, having to roll your sleeves up and do a lot more.
Sure. So, would you do it again? And how do you think you compare it to most other Aussies that do the UK or the London thing? Right. So, how did you take that compared to what was other options?
Absolutely, would do it again. I mean,
Yeah.
that I in fact, most of the conversations I have with folks that are sort of starting out in the career, particularly this part of the world, my advice would be if there's any opportunity to get out into the different part of the world. I think that's one of the real appeals about going back to the question about the career choice and why finance. It's one of those careers that it is transportable.
Definitely.
And so absolutely would do that again. It is interesting you make that sort of comparison between the UK and Asia in many ways, that there were really, in many ways sort of traditional places for people to go.
Sure.
The opportunity in the US tends to be a bit more few and far between.
Sure.
And so you probably don't have, again, going back to the numbers, you probably don't have the same amount.
Sure.
I think sort of Aussies do well in terms of representation. In the UK, there tend to be a lot
Yeah.
there. I think obviously New York and the US in general is growing and it continues to
Yep.
grow. But during that time, I think it's fair to say it was probably not a fraction of, but a much smaller subset of Aussies that tend to
Yep.
get up there for various reasons.
Sure. Sure.
But yeah, I think, as I said, my advice to those sort of starting out after sort of establishing themselves, any opportunity to get to some of these sort of major centers, particularly in the world of finance, I mean,
Mm.
where it is the epicenter in many
Yep.
ways, as much as obviously Australia's a growing market and it is a significant part of the overall
Yeah.
the market. I mean, at the end of the day, we talk whether it's the UK, the Asian market, or the US. These are significant. I mean, as I said, sort of the mecca when it comes to
Yeah.
global capital markets. So to live and breathe that day to day, but then also that personal piece around being in a different environment, different culture, and sort of learning different ways of doing things is also, I think invaluable
Yep.
from a professional and personal development perspective.
Yeah. Great. So how was it coming home?
Tough, yeah, tough. Of
Yeah.
ultimately, like most, coming home was a family decision.
Yep.
It was nice to come home to be close
Mm.
to the family, but yeah, it's always have fond memories, and you never know, at some point keen to get back up
Yep.
and experience or sort of experience different parts of the world as well. But yeah, I mean, nice as I said, different stage of the career where then family become a pretty critical part with kids on the way,
Yep.
and being around that support network was really helpful
Sure.
returning back.
Did it accelerate your progression coming back home, the international experience, or do you think it made it harder to reintegrate back to the same path you were making?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there's an element of both. I think there's a piece
Okay.
of like, again, as much as you're part of the same organization, you're out of sight, out of mind in many ways. So you're sort of building
Yeah.
out a bit of a career and experience in a different part of the world. So there's an element of reconnecting and reestablishing yourself in this market. And I don't
Mm.
know, it's something that you've come across with as well in terms of that. Culturally, we're
Yeah.
in an environment where local experience matters, and it's
Yeah.
not dissimilar where you've been
Sure.
offshore for a period of time, even though you're still learning the fundamentals, you're still learning the key areas of the industry.
Yep.
There tends to be this sort of bias towards the local market experience. So that's definitely a case of
So,
reestablishing.
so you experienced that even within the same business?
Yeah, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
people move on, right? People move
Yeah.
on. In NAB, like most large organisations, there's been there's changes, there's
Sure.
restructures, there's
Yeah.
different leaders come and go, and so
Yep.
there's an element of reestablishing presence and the fact that you're back
Yeah.
and you're sort of trying to find your next role.
Yep.
But I think in saying that though, once you sort of work through
Sure.
that,
Yeah.
in terms of the value that and not just with that role, but I'm sure anyone that's had that experience offshore and done some time in some of these markets, when you come back over the long run, I think a lot of that experience is it actually does support you because you've come across different scenarios and
Definitely.
situations and exposed to something that you wouldn't ordinarily day to day.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think, and whether it's subtly or more obvious, some of those skills and learning, comes through. And so, I have no doubt. Again, sort of the advice that I give to others that having that exposure, I think in the long run, regardless of where you end up,
Yeah.
I think that those skills and experience that you pick up along the way helps. But there's absolutely a case of trying to reconnect back in with the market that you come back to.
So why do you think that local experience thing is so prevalent? Because your exact example, same business,
Yeah.
legitimately the epicenter of banking and finance in the world in New York City, and you're coming back. Why do you think there is that hesitancy or resistance, or not necessarily for NAB, but just on a broader perspective? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I reflect on that, and I know I was sort of speaking to some friends and colleagues that have similar experiences. I think fundamentally it does come down to supply and demand as well. There's a factor of that. Like at the end of the day, we're still a pretty small economy, and so generally speaking, I said there's no shortage of talent, and even though you've got expats that are repatriating, or you've also got the international community that that they want to expat into Australia. So when you think about it as an overall population, an option for employers, then they're sport for choice. And so there's a tendency to say, look, if I had a pecking order or preference, I'd love to have someone that has local experience, A,
Yeah.
and then B, the natural one to say, recent local experience, because again, we're in an economy and in a workforce and an environment that's constantly changing.
Mm.
And so there is whether it's intentional or unintentional, there's probably a bias to say, look, really want someone that's, has an understanding of the local dynamics, and then anything that's relevant, because the way we're doing things now are very different to what we were doing 10 years ago. And so by default, I think what tends to happen is, as I said, there's a real strong preference to say, okay, the local experience is critical and it needs to be quite timely from that point of view.
Yep.
And then unfortunately what that means is, there's, it can come across as a bias, but
Sure.
I think fundamentally it comes down to, as I said, I think at the crux of it's a supply and demand, which then has a knock-on impact to say, look, we're just going to pick based on this criteria, and not necessarily thinking a bit broader, because those people that have spent time offshore, they bring a different perspective, and no doubt they can reintegrate and reconnect into the market. But I think there's a sort of path of least resistance is my assumption. I don't know if you've got a view, but I think that's sort of my take on it.
So given you lived it, how critical do you think it actually is?
What's that in
the local experience versus international experience? Because considering that the US, particularly for New York banking market, is much more complex than the Australian market. So how critical do you think the local experience is? When
I think in many ways it's sort of rhetorical. I think there's nuances. Obviously, every market has its nuances, whether it's the regulatory landscape, the economy. But I still say that having that exposure, it puts you in a much better position than someone that may not necessarily have had that diversity of experience. And so, to answer your question, I think it is a consideration. I don't think it's the be all end all, because at the end of the day, when you are in this market, you sort of pick up on those subtleties and the nuances. And we see people all the time, you see some of the very senior people in whether it's in the financial services or other companies being employed from different parts of the world. They're bringing that sort of experience here. There's a nuance and there's a uniqueness of it, but at the end of the day, they're interchangeable in terms of the skills and what you can apply. So I think ultimately that's just a short-term consideration, but I think from a supply point of view, whether it's sort of that recruitment world or the employer, and just again, this is a tendency to sort of go path of least resistance.
A quick one before we get back to it. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably already know that I recruit for senior finance professionals for high growth businesses. That's what I do outside of this show. My approach is built around storytelling. When I take on a search, I build a narrative around the business, who they are, what they're building, where they're going, and why that role matters. Before I reach out to a single candidate, I tell that story across multiple channels to my network of over 28,000 finance professionals in Australia, so that when I do start conversations, candidates already know who you are and there's a level of buy-in before I even contact them. So if you're a founder, CEO, or CFO that's thinking about a finance hire, even if it's early days, I'm always happy to chat. Whether that's a question, some free advice, or a sense check on what the market looks like. You can find me on LinkedIn or at storyrecruitment.com.au. All right, let's get back into it.
So you got back and there was a period of time, but then COVID happened. And so you had a pretty similar massive global event to what you went through for the GFC within the same business. That's quite a unique perspective. What do you think the business approached it in similar ways, or what was your perspective on it, given you've gone through a similar scale event in the past? Do you think you'd approached it differently yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think at the crux of it, it was similar in the sense that both of them were that sort of black swan. Black swan. There's so many black swan events. I don't know if you classify them that, but that was another one that took everyone by complete surprise in many ways. It was a complete shock. I think when I reflect on the difference, albeit they were both quite significant in their own right. I think COVID was in many ways operationally very different. Right? There was the GFC in many ways was a fundamental issue that ultimately led to a crack in the system. Whereas COVID operationally, it literally went from things being open one day to shut the next. But across every different sector and every different industry, whether you're the local milk bar or the largest organisation in the economy,
Yeah.
you were impacted. And so there was a uniqueness to it. I dare say not everyone was
Sure.
prepped or had
Yep.
that sort of mindset as to, yeah, sure, there's business continuity plans and people have an understanding of what they'll do, but for things to sort of shut and
Yep.
be done at that pace, I think operationally it brought a different perspective.
Yep.
And COVID was really more about, in many ways, it was sort of survival and continuity.
Yep.
As I said, had a very strong operational risk lens, whereas fundamentally at the heart of it, the GFC was as I said, more of a credit issue,
Sure.
which led to issues in the broader system.
Yep.
But the key theme, the key themes are similar in many ways. It comes back to sort of the basics around, cost discipline was a key, growth. You've got to fund growth properly. Survival in terms of how do you keep people engaged, connected to the organisation. People no longer being able to physically get to places where they need to. The knock-on impact, and then really, when it sort of kicked off, it was really a question of how long can this go for, right? It became a question of is this the new normal, or are we going to come out of it? What does it look like?
Yeah.
And you'd argue, I'm sure most people will say that we live in a world now, even though it's sort of 5-6 years on, that there's still remnants of it. That,
definitely.
We live with that now. That's here to stay indefinitely. But at the time, it was a case of, okay, what does this mean? And some of it we didn't know till we lived it. There was an anticipation or potential expectation that, hey, these are the impacts. But it wasn't until that we lived through some of that to say, okay, this is how it's going to change, etc. So, yeah, very, very unique, obviously, set of circumstances that all businesses had to face.
So, given you lived through it prior, in terms of the crisis management and people management and just supporting the team, did you feel more equipped, or at least more equipped to give advice, at least?
In some ways, yeah. In some ways, because I think there is aspects of it. There's some similarities to it around a shock to the system, what it means, and sort of trying to navigate through that period. But to be frank, I mean, most of what we experienced during that period in particular, the COVID times, I think it was unique. As I said, not most, in fact, all would have said never experienced anything like that, and more from a sense of how connected that impact was globally as well. Like this was not, typically in the past, it's it could be isolated to a certain region or a certain industry but this was literally every part of the world. Obviously, different parts of the world managed it differently, but everyone was impacted in some way. And then from a sector and industry point of view, again, there was no industry that wasn't impacted in some way. So there was a uniqueness of it. Some of the thematics are similar in terms of how you sort of work through that crisis management and sort of how you navigate. But in large part, there was a uniqueness to it that no one was really prepared for.
No, fair. And so, what was it? 16 and a half years, 17-ish years.
Close to that.
What led up to moving on?
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, really, relatively long stint, but really fortunate to have done a number of different things and moved around. But I think for me, it was more of a case of what else is out there. Like most have sort of been institutions for long periods of time, you obviously can build out a career. I mean, these are large organisations, and they continue to be quite diverse in terms of what you can do. But personally, for me, it was about where else, or what else can I apply the skills and experience to and have an impact on. And so for me, it was really an opportunity to say, okay, what does it look like outside the world of the big four banks? And so an opportunity came along to pursue what was, I guess, my first CFO role. Still in financial services, still in banking, regulated banking, but a very different landscape.
Yep. So on that, you're going from kind of different ends of the scale, not completely, but like massive business to a much more smaller environment. Was that a challenge?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think we talked about it a little bit in terms of the differences between the home market and being offshore, but going from a business of 30-odd thousand staff to one that's just under 200, that there's an obvious difference. Quite interesting. It's a question I get asked a lot, in terms of, how did you navigate and what was the thought process? Look, I think at a fundamental level, the issues are still the same. You're still looking to achieve sustainability in the business model. You're still
Yep.
looking to deliver for your customers at the end of the day.
Yep.
Your balance sheet strength is something still, irrespective of which
Yeah.
industry or what size business, that's still imperative. The
Mm.
scale is the obvious one. You're
Yep.
going from, as I said, a much larger organization. Your impact is more nuanced in terms of what you're trying to achieve.
Mm.
You don't have the pockets that the larger organizations do. So obviously you need to be a little bit more deliberate and
Okay.
tactical in terms of what you're looking to pursue. But ultimately you're still trying to achieve the same outcome. So again, I think my time offshore, being in that sort of small operation,
Yeah.
more
Okay.
nuanced in terms of the setup, put me in good stead in terms of
Yeah.
what I was getting myself into in terms of the role at Hume Bank.
Yep.
And as I said, yeah, it's a different mindset. I mean, pros and cons, like most things.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, as I said, the obvious difference just being the scale.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think were the major pros out of moving to a much smaller business?
The pros, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the obvious ones to me, the one that stood out is just the cut through, right?
Yeah.
You sort of in some of these larger organisations, we talked about having to navigate through, what are big institutions, a lot of people, a lot of
Yep.
committees, a lot of governance, rightly
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and you're having to navigate through a lot of that, at a smaller setup. By definition, you're sort of cutting through
Yep.
a lot more. Your exposure to, even those at the, I guess more junior level of the
Yep.
organisation, their exposure that they would have to senior management or the
Mm.
board or
Yep.
other stakeholders is much more, prevalent in a small organisation, and you tend to become, again, not just in a CFO role, but in most
Mm.
roles, you tend to become a jack of all trades because
Yep.
you're just exposed to a lot more. So from a pro point of view, if you take a career lens or a development lens, I think there's a uniqueness to it where,
Yep.
at a larger organization, although you do get to move around, you become very specialized in a certain area, whereas now you are, as I said, you're sort of exposed to a lot more. You're seeing things that you wouldn't ordinarily be involved
Okay.
in,
Yep.
and so you become not so much a generalist, but yeah, you just see a lot more of the organization end to end. So
Yep.
from a development and a career growth perspective, if you get people get the opportunity to do that, I think that brings a different angle and a nuance, which is again quite valuable. Just different.
100%. So, given it was your first CFO role as well, was there anything you didn't anticipate or didn't expect coming in?
Not necessarily. I think it's a different perspective. Obviously,
Sure.
like I had sort of come from more sort of treasury type, as I said, capital markets type roles, which is in many ways tends to be a
Mm.
subset of what an overall
Yep.
CFO remit is.
Yep.
There was definitely a big part of the operational side of the business, which again,
Mm.
in a well-established organisation with systems, processes,
Sure.
frameworks in place, a lot of that tends to be, has been going on for a long time. Whereas now you're sort of leaning into some of this, whether it's a case of establishing them for the first time,
Mm.
reinvigorating them because they're no
Yep.
longer fit for purpose, changing things around. So that change management angle
Mm.
at a smaller organization is probably that, you are prepared for, because
Yep.
there's an element of that irrespective of where you're at, but I think it's more pronounced
Yeah.
in a small place. So you're leaning into a lot more of that transformational change management piece that you would ordinarily at a larger place.
Sure. And where do you see things going for the business over the next few years, or at the minute, next 6-12 months?
Look, I think they're in a great position. Obviously, it's a subset of the overall banking landscape in terms of
Mm.
mutuals in general.
Yep.
Not dissimilar to what we've seen in other industries where we are seeing consolidation.
Yep.
There are some challenges around how do you remain relevant.
Mm.
Obviously, you're not dissimilar to other ADIs. Obviously, some of the challenges with regards to the macro economy, the regulatory impulse, the technology that's required, customer expectations as well.
Yep.
The business, in particular, Hume, I think it's in a great shape in terms of carving out, that point of difference and delivering, what is somewhat a unique customer value proposition
Yep.
in that part of the world. I think generally, as a general comment for the industry itself, I think the challenges come down to how do you differentiate and how do you sort of stand out from the crowd in a world where, we're seeing things are, obviously more costly, things are getting faster, the
Yep.
requirement and investment needed is more significant. And so, again,
Yep.
when you're in a smaller organization, how do you carve out some of that, and how do you ensure that the business is still sustainable longer term
Yep.
in terms of navigating through some of those challenges? But yeah, overall, I think, if you are able to differentiate and sort of deliver on that, customer value, then I think, there is more to be done, and you can
Yep.
continue sort of delivering for the customers in the long run.
So, because AI is just such a classic thing that everyone's talking about, right? But
Yeah.
specifically for banking, given it's such a core, like the credibility and trust is such a core part to it, and that's often some of the major resistance for AI. Like, how is that being received or used or implemented in the banking space?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not dissimilar to other industries. I think,
Yeah.
that everyone's in agreement that it is going to have an impact, a
Yep.
significant impact. I think
Yep.
one of the interesting things is it's probably still a case of trying to work out where. Like, there's so
Yeah.
many use cases for it. Whether it's the
Yeah.
operational side, whether it's the customer facing aspect, whether it's the
Yep.
risk management. Obviously,
Yep.
from a finance point of view, again, no doubt will have a significant, and is having a significant impact.
Yep.
I think you're right. I think it is that there's an element of trade-off around the trust piece, and how to organizations navigate through, what is more exposure, because you're opening yourself up. But the reality is, it's, in many ways, the AI, the ability to sort of compress the function and do things more efficiently is going to happen
Yep.
irrespective. I think, it's a case of the stuff that become, or the stuff is more the activity that's more mundane and
Yep.
more repetitive becomes
Yep.
automated,
Yep.
and then allows businesses to spend less time on that, and more time on sort of what, quote unquote, it's a value adding
Yeah.
component of it. And so, yeah, I think as a general rule of thumb, I would say from a finance point of view, as I said, the function overall, definitely from an operational perspective, becomes
Yep.
condensed, but the expectations from a CFO/finance team in many ways becomes heightened, because
Yep.
now, using those tools and resources to lean into, in many ways, a not different area, but you're sort of adding value in different ways by using that equipment that's available.
Yeah, yeah. And so, where do you see AI separate? Where do you see the industry going? Your space, your role going over the next 18 months?
Yeah, everyone. It seems like, every chat, every conversation, is
Yeah.
flavour of the month, no doubt, and rightly so. Look, I think it is a game changer in many ways. I think for me, without sort of looking longer term, the immediate impact is obviously as I said, sort of removing the tasks, or the efficiency of getting things done. Is condensed in a significant way. What it does mean then, it starts shifting the focus now, and it was always part of the case, but I think going back, historically, it would be a case of a lot more time was spent on the operational side of the business, whereas
Yep.
now the influence, the narrative, the judgment, in many ways, the EQ side of the business becomes more significant. So the tools are there to provide, in many ways, the numbers and the outcomes at a much more quicker and more efficient perspective, but to be able to then translate that, have an influence on the business,
Yep.
lean into what does that actually mean. Still,
Yeah.
over time, no doubt AI will close that gap there too, but I think that's where it becomes more prevalent, particularly for, think about sort of the finance function.
Yep.
This concept of storytelling, which is so critical for any business, and how do you sort of bring stakeholders along. I think that, the AI piece allows you to get to that starting point a lot quicker, but it doesn't change the fact that, as I said, a lot of those sort of softer skills around that influence and judgment, and
Yep.
really that sort of overall storytelling will become more and more critical.
100%. I think storytelling as a whole, just in any industry, in any role, is such a critical piece, and particularly as everything just gets more tech enabled or AI enhanced and streamlined, that ability to connect with people is such an underrated but hugely powerful tool.
Yeah, and I think most things are now, there's a lot of transactional. Most things are transactional these days, in terms of whether it's relationships customers have with their banking relationships, or other forms of services. It is quite transactional. It's quite broad. Like, you'll have exposure to a number of different organizations. So it becomes a case of, how do you build that loyalty? How do you build that consistency and continuity with, whether it's your customer base other stakeholders. I think, as I said, AI gives us the tools to be able to do it, in a much cheaper, more efficient way, but sort of having that connectivity and making sure that, you're bringing people along, I think that's going to be here to stay.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think that's as good of a point as any to finish up, but really appreciate your time, Akbar. I think your approach to navigating across a career at the same business but still progressing has been fantastic. And then navigating again to the other side of the spectrum in a much smaller business, I think there's a lot of value to be taken out of that, and I think the listeners would agree. So if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out, get any advice from yourself, is that something you're open to?
Absolutely, yeah, more than happy. I love connecting with people, and I mean, obviously the obvious one is through LinkedIn, but through yourself, Tom, or if anyone's got any questions, more than happy to connect with people and have ongoing conversations. Really appreciate the opportunity.
No worries. Well, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the CFO Track. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. I'll see you next time.